Hi and welcome to the Demystifying Mental Toughness podcast for athletes, coaches and professionals who want to achieve their goals faster. I'm David Charlton and I'll be sharing proven methods from leading athletes, coaches and experts that will help you get the most from your talent. Today's show is sponsored by Functional Intelligent Training, who are a sports injury clinic located in Gosforth near Newcastle upon Tyne and specialise in athlete development, nurturing future champions, strength and conditioning support and excellent rehabilitation services. Right now, as I speak, it's particularly challenging and stressful. It's a time of year which is normally associated where people are looking to the future in a positive manner. They're pretty upbeat. However, this January, it's very different. We're in the middle of the coronavirus pandemic. In the UK, we've just gone into lockdown 3, and there's a lot of uncertainty around. So this episode is going to be very topical. It's very important. And Dr. John Perry goes on to discuss how you can deal with the stresses and strains in the new year and how you can go on to thrive in 2021. Moving forward and not only surviving. Hi, John. Obviously, the listeners possibly won't be aware of who you are. Could you just let them know and give them some insight into what sparked your interest into mental toughness?
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on the podcast, David. So I'm a psychologist and an academic. My original interest came long before any kind of academic study. So I'd be, for my pains, a Grimsby Town fan. I was very fortunate growing up around the time I did, sort of late 80s, early 90s. We were really good, so at least I can kind of cling on to those memories. But I'll always remember I'd go watch the team play, and somewhere around the mid-90s, I remember I was watching us be a bit inconsistent in the league, but we had a great team of real triers. And we came up against West Brom in a game. Now, our manager had left Grimsby to go to West Brom and come back and brought a bunch of ex-West Brom players. And I think our starting 11 on that day had about 5 ex-West Brom players who had all kind of been rejected, really. And they were near the top of the league. We were near the bottom in what's now the Championship. And in the first half, I watched us absolutely obliterate them. We were 4-0 up at half-time, finished 4-1. Was that these players, no doubt, always go out to try their best. You'd never have said that they were only at 80%, only at 90%, and deliberately holding anything back. But when there was an extra psychological variable there, they had something to prove. That 5 of the starting 11 had all been sold by the other team. They looked like world beaters. And it just struck me at that moment, as a teenager at the time, that actually things like effort and motivation and performing under pressure, they're not like a choice. People talk about putting in maximum effort as if it's, oh, okay, I'll do that. But it's a skill. And that kind of always stuck with me. So then I kind of went on, and through my study, I was interested in sports science, and I was interested in psychology. So I did my degree and master's degree and PhD and everything. And I've worked as a lecturer since 2005 in psychology/sports psychology. Sometimes I'm more into personality. Sometimes I'm more into stress. Sometimes it's sport-specific stuff. And I have a few interests that I look at from a research point of view. One, of course, is mental toughness. And I'd be particularly involved in the measurement of mental toughness. And because for my sins, I'd be quite good at the stats stuff. So I do a lot of the measurement stuff, then trying to identify how does that translate into practice. What really irritates me sometimes in psychology is we try and measure stuff, especially in personality-based psychology, but we never operationalize it in a way that relates to the end user. So what we try and do in the mental toughness stuff is not just have this arbitrary value of, oh, you get this score. We go, okay, what's that score actually mean? And when you talk about developing mental toughness, like what observable changes are you going to see? When somebody changes from one score to another score, how would that look in real life? Not just a number on a page. So that kind of thing always interests me. And I also do research into more broadly kind of coping strategies that people use to be able to manage stresses. And I also do a bit of research in temporal psychology, which is the extent to which we're kind of past, present, or future oriented as well. And again, the measurement element's a real challenge there, because as you know, listeners interested in sports psychology will know, when we talk about flow and being present, it's kind of hard to measure if somebody's present focused, because the minute you start thinking about being in the present, you're no longer in the present, you know. So, but hey, those kind of challenges are what's there for us to try and unpick as researchers. So probably about 80% of what I do, I'm currently head of psychology at Mary Immaculate College in Ireland. So 80% of what I do is probably on the academic research side of things, and the rest is where I managed to get involved in some of the applied work and do bits of consultancy. Now, I'd like that to be more of a 50-50 balance, but you know, the reality of it sometimes makes that a real challenge.
That makes sense. Can I take you back then to your youth then, or Grimsby Town then? I'm quite intrigued. So where does mental toughness fit into those Grimsby Town players then, whose performance dipped and they underperformed over a period of time?
Yeah, so I think what I'm trying to do as I sort of make meaning of it and understand things a little bit more, you take your experiences from the time plus your knowledge from further down the line, and you sort of try and mash it all together. And when I think back to that process now, I think I've gone on a journey from thinking it was a motivational aspect to actually seeing it as more of a way of integrating motivation into a stress response. So I thought it was motivational because I thought, well, these guys are just trying harder. You know, they've found that extra gear that they've gone into. They were that little bit quicker. You know, when you're watching a player, if a winger's closing down a fullback to put some pressure on them in their own half, the example I often give to athletes is, you can tell if somebody's running with genuine intent because they believe they're going to affect something there, or whether they're going through emotions. And an example I often give is, if you've ever seen someone running for the bus, you can always tell the difference between the person running for the bus who don't think they're really going to run for the bus, but they'll pick up the pace to see what happens, versus the person who genuinely thinks they're going to get the bus. And on that day, every time a player closed someone down, it was that second category. You got the impression that they genuinely believed they were going to get there, or they were going to force an error. And as I say, I thought that was a motivational thing. But actually, and as I'm starting to talk about there, sort of things like belief, it starts to become a confidence thing. But also the context is important. And the context was this added pressure component. And one of the reasons I really love looking at individual differences, personality, those kind of things, is if any of the listeners have ever been in a high-performance dressing room before a game, you could have 20 different people in that dressing room, 30 different people in that dressing room. And the context is quite similar, but the individual responses are very different. And I find that really interesting. And what is it about those individual responses? Why is it that some players actually see this situation where they're playing against a team that have previously rejected them? They've got opposing fans who think, geez, this guy's rubbish. What's he going to do? They've got their own stresses of the team aren't performing very well anyway, and the last few games haven't gone particularly well. So there's so many different sort of stress contexts in there. And on that day, fortunately, the players that were in there showed that rather than kind of running away from that stress, that they're able not to just get through it, battle through it, which we always sort of talk about resilience. And I know one of the questions always comes up, resilience, mental toughness. So I think Peter spoke about that a couple of weeks ago. but it's not about getting through it. The real kind of those flow performances are when you use that, you bring your whole self into that performance, and you thrive on every kind of emotion that you're feeling. And the more I kind of understand those experiences, like watching that game, the more I start to see it as a response to a pressure situation rather than it being about really wanting to do well, and, this sort of more simple motivational context.
What happens in the brain in those high pressure situations then?
Yeah, I mean, there's different ways it can go, and there's different individuals. So in terms of what I believe happens is from an individual perspective, some people will kind of become a bit more introvert. They go within themselves. They become a smaller version of who they are, if you like. And they're people that the cognitive component really takes over. And I mentioned sort of time perspective, temporal psychology earlier. And when people are really honed in this cognitive element, you're thinking a lot. And when the people are thinking a lot, you think about the past and various, kind of memories and disappointments and all successes. And you think about the future, which can manifest itself as worry sometimes. But the individuals that I always kind of look at with an amazement, really, are the ones who, although they might be motivated by the past or the future, and I believe these to be the more mentally tough individuals, they're able to kind of have this holistic approach of the present. And in terms of what's happening in their brains, I think they start to move that thought to become more of an affective state, more of a feeling. And that's where, when you see people performing at the very top, when we talk about passion and desire and determination, anger, whatever they might be, these are not things that you think. You don't think passion, you don't think desire, you don't think anger, you feel them. And I think that's what's happening, is the people who are tougher are able to recognize the function of that thought, the function of that feeling, and be able to remain present by moving cognitive states into more affective states, more feelings, and being able to really gain the energy and the drive from those feelings and put them into the performance. And to me, that's why I'll always, it doesn't matter whether I do some work in an education setting or a health setting or a business setting or something, that's why I kind of always have this love for sport, because I think that's where it's kind of most visceral, where that kind of thing happens. And one of the big advantages I feel of sport is that it's so unique in that sense, in that it creates those situations all the time. As a researcher, it's like having a lab for you with these kind of controlled, contrived conditions where people are met with uncertainty, because that's the point of sport, to create uncertainty, because that's where the excitement comes from. So we can see how they respond to it, and we can see what works well and what doesn't work well for different people. And then we can take that and we can use that in different circumstances. As we
go on into 2021, naturally 2020 has been a tough year for a lot of people with COVID. How does what you've just talked there about sport translate into just everyday life and helping people go on to move forward, to prosper in 2021? Yeah,
it's a good question. I think with sport and with any sort of performance context, what we see a lot of is the majority of people actually strive to put themselves into stressful situations. People like being outside the comfort zone. People like developing in that respect. And that doesn't matter whether it's sport, whether it's recreational exercise, whether it's someone's career, whether it's relationships, whether it's playing on a computer game, whatever it is, we have this sort of natural drive to kind of live on the edge of our comfort zone. Now, some people have that more than others. Some people love to live actually quite a little bit beyond. and they're the kind of the wild card types. And some people actually prefer to be slightly inside, but even the most cautious people are actually, they're still looking to develop. They're still looking to get towards the end of that. In terms of what we can learn from sport is, I think it's the longevity of that progression. That's one of the things that, and I'm sure you've come across this as well, that if you work in sports psychology, you'll often have approaches to say, can you come and work with this team or this individual or whatever, because we've got some playoffs coming and we want to perform well. And you go, yeah, sure, I'll bring my magic wand. And whereas actually what we want to do is we want to see sustainable developments that last. And essentially, as the psychologist, you make yourself redundant. They don't need you anymore. They're able to take those skills forward. And what we see in sport, and I'll go back to my being a Grimsby Town fan, one of the things it does do is it teaches you that failure and disappointment is a consistency in life. And encountering that and then moving on and learning from the experience. And in sport, you do it all the time. Because regardless of what sport it is, whether you're successful or whether you're unsuccessful, next tournament, next match, next competition, that actually doesn't make a whole pile of difference. This is a new one and it goes again. And I know you like golf. One of the things I love about golf is if you play a bad shot, your next shot's a new opportunity. And if you play a good shot, the game has a very nice knack of making sure you don't start getting carried away with yourself and thinking that you're really the bee's knees because you've played one good shot. So in playing sport, either within the game or in matches or tournaments, we regularly encounter these highs and these lows. And the thing I take from it that I think can impact in everybody's lives is in a less obvious way, and maybe the peaks and the troughs aren't quite as high or as low in everyday life. But that's the key to it. It's the longevity. We don't experience many things that are a one-off, once in a lifetime. We have good days, we have bad days, we have an awful lot of in-between days. And the easiest thing to do is to keep on coasting through them. And we do that in relationships. And relationships kind of lose a spark. We do that with our health. You know, you have a moment where diet starts Monday, you get yourself fit and healthy, or new year, new me, you know, in January, we're all thinking about that kind of thing. And then we start cruising and we go back into autopilot. Now, high sports performance doesn't let you do that because you've got these really regular, objective outcomes of how well you did that force you to reflect and force you to learn as you go. And I think if you can kind of, on a lesser level, bring that into your everyday life. So if I wanted to get myself fit or eat healthier or do better at work or do better in college or whatever it was, if I can force myself to have these kind of regular reflections, okay, well, I did this or I failed to do that. Why? You try and make meaning of that experience. Try and think. And it doesn't have to be a major thing. It can be a very minor thing. It can be I said I wasn't going to have a takeaway, and then it got to Friday night, and I thought, sod it, I'll have a takeaway. You can still make sense of that. You can still make meaning of that. Well, why did I do it? There was a reason behind it. Because that's what we would do in elite level sport. Yeah, and that, I suppose, that comes like naturally to some people, but not others. I know some clients I've worked with, they've been like highly talented, highly skilled, and like one of the frustrations has been that they've just kept on making the same mistakes and repeating mistakes and not learning from those. What would you say to that type of person? Yeah, well, they can be a real challenge when that's the case. But I always feel reflection's a very difficult skill. Developing self-awareness is very difficult. For some people, it comes naturally. For some, as you mentioned, it doesn't. But it's a workable and a developable skill at all times. And it's funny, because when we talk about things like developing mental toughness, in a sense, the development of mental toughness is almost the outcome of it. You develop the skills through reflection, through self-awareness, whereby you You try out new things. You learn from different situations. You understand why you felt that way, why you reacted that way in a certain situation. And then over time, when you encounter future situations, you'll start to respond in a more mentally tough way. Now, when you have those individuals where that middle pin is missing, we have to kind of think about the language we use. For example, reflect. Nah, that's imagine talking to a 19-year-old lad who just wants to be a footballer. Let's start talking about personal and self-reflection. Doesn't work. So the language we use, I think, is really important. The kind of core psychological skills that we might use, counselling skills, being comfortable with that silence, creating that awkward silence, asking a question and not feeling like you need to answer it. And even if they don't answer it, it's okay. Let it linger. I think one of the things I've learned over the years, and that's not to say I've mastered it by any means, is patience when you're trying to sort of get this development. I think early on, you kind of feel like you want to be seen to be making a difference, like you're earning your money, so you start to intervene, and you almost try and do the performer or the client's job of the responding and the thinking. And I think having that as the coach or consultant, having that confidence to say, okay, well, it's not actually about this session having a particular outcome, this chat having a particular outcome. And it's okay if it's awkward, and it's okay if there's silences, and it's okay if this individual right now doesn't see the value in what we're talking about. But just let it linger, let it be a bit awkward, let them go, ask them next time, did you get a chance to think about that at all? Have another awkward meeting, and you kind of never try and rush it and never try and force it. And I know myself, I was very guilty of that early on, when I kind of thought, right, I'm the psychologist. I need to do something. I need to, I think just having that patience and enjoying the awkwardness and the silence and waiting.
That's interesting, because in a way, what you're talking about there is the story that you can build in your head as a psychologist is very important, which gets back to a little bit of what you talked about earlier as well, about really COVID and just different stressful situations, be it on a football pitch, on a golf course, whatever. That story you're telling yourself is a huge part in that.
Yeah, I think the narratives you build, I just think are so important. And that would be another thing I would use with individuals that maybe aren't naturally reflective and aware, is we'll pick out an example, a moment, and we'll just talk through it. And then when they explain something to me, they do it in a very descriptive way, because they're not really reflecting on how they felt or what was going on in their head or responded. But they describe a story, something that happened. And then I might start just probing or challenging things and try and get them to see that, well, that's their narrative. So actually what happened, there was an objective truth that happened, but that's a sort of an invisible thing. No, none of us actually ever see that. We all see our version of it. And over time, our version kind of fits our own narrative that we're building. If anyone were to talk to people they went to school with, you could be the same age in the same class with the same teachers, but you've probably all got a very different story about what the school was like. Because over the years, you've tried to make sense of it in a way that fits your understanding of the world. And that would be something I would do a lot of with individuals that, as I say, maybe reflection isn't their natural kind of process that they go to, but I can help them to understand that when they describe something that happened, they're describing it based on their understanding of that situation, which might actually be biased to fit a sort of a pre-existing narrative. So if somebody feels that I'm this kind of victim, people are always picking on me, people are always having a go at me, or they want to bring down, then you can ask them about instances and start to kind of unpick that some other people might see it differently.
Yeah, no, I like that. So we'll look to wrap up in a few moments. If we're thinking about moving forward, prospering in 2021, what are the three takeaways from our conversation that you would advise the listeners to do?
One very good question. Three takeaways. So the first one there I would say would be the based on that last point about making meaning in things, understanding that your story, your memories are your narrative on it, and ask yourself, are there other ways that I could have built that narrative? I think the second one would be the thing I would go to around the way that when we're present minded, it's a feeling, and I think there's a real skill there in being able to try and transition from that sort of cognitive level of here's what's happening, which is normally rooted in the past or the future, into making that an affective state. It becomes more of a feeling, which means your feeling is present. Like it's hard to be not present when the thing that's kind of engulfing you at this moment is an affective domain, a feeling, an emotion. And the third one would probably be back to the first point I made, where it's easy to see people's behaviours through a motivational lens, and I think that's because we oversimplify what motivation is, and we sometimes see it as entirely controllable, whereas motivation really requires a cognitive and an affective response to a situation, normally a pressurized situation. I think it's easy for us to have this misconception that motivation comes first and then action comes as a result of that motivation, because that's how we understand motivation. But it's a much more complicated cycle than that. And realistically, what we do is we respond to things, and then based on how we feel from that response, that changes our motivation to engage in those things again. And we kind of go through these cycles rather than this motivation that lead to action, sort of really simple approach to things. And for that exact reason, I'll always tell people that if you kind of want to do something but you're struggling for motivation, just ask yourself, am I falling into this trap of thinking that action can't happen first? Thinking that always there has to be the motivation first. Sometimes you can have an action as a response, and then the motivation will follow.
Fascinating, that is. Yeah, when I think of sports psychology, the word process is used an awful lot. Focus on the process as opposed to the outcome. And yeah, those three little processes you've mentioned there are certainly going to help all of the listeners, no doubt about it. So yeah, thank you, John, for your time and for your insight. It's been hugely helpful.
Pleasure talking to you, David.
So whereabouts can the listeners find you? Where can they contact you if they would like to ask you a few questions?
They can find me. They can find me on Twitter at JohnPerry81, without giving my age away. Or they can drop me an email, john.perry@mic.ul.ie. But I'm sure if you Google sort of John Perry psychology or something, I'd like to think I'd come up somewhere.
Excellent. I'll make sure those contact details are in the show notes for the listeners there. And again, I really appreciate your time. Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you.
As a company at Inspiring Sporting Excellence, we're working with a range of athletes and executives to deal with the stresses and strains of the pandemic, as well as supporting them to ensure that they go on to hit the ground running in 2021. So if you'd like to get in touch for a short chat, you'll notice in the show notes there's a link to my diary. Or if you'd just like to have a chat about the show, you might have some feedback, or you might be able to share some suggestions to improve the show going forward, please get in touch. Please book a time in my diary. I'd like to give a big thanks to today's sponsors, Functional Intelligent Training, who are a sports injury clinic located in Gosforth, near Newcastle upon Tyne, and specialise in athlete development, nurturing future champions, strength and conditioning support, and excellent rehabilitation services. Thank you for listening to Demystifying Mental Toughness today. To sign up for tips and advice to help you be the best that you can be, go to www.sport-excellence.co.uk and sign up to the Mental Edge newsletter.